My name is Lieutenant Colonel retired Susan Beharriell, and I joined the forces in 1973 right out of high school. I was in the first platoon of women to do the same basic training as the men. And none of the men had any thought that we would actually succeed. In fact, they said, women can't do that. Well, we showed them all, and we proved that women could indeed do it. And partway through that training, they decide what particular profession within the military you are going to be in. And so I applied for intelligence. But they told me that women weren't allowed to do that. But I insisted, and eventually they decided to come and interview me. And so when I was at university at Queen's in Kingston, they sent 3 senior officers from Ottawa to interview me to see what made me tick. And I give them full marks for that, because in those days there were a lot of women who were just trying to get into non-traditional jobs because they just proved that they could. But they had no intention of following it as a profession. And you could only tell so much from a paper file. So they came and interviewed me for the better part of a day, not much of which I could see had anything to do with the future career as an intelligence officer. But anyway, they finally decided that, yes, they would allow me into the branch. But the officer who told me that looked me straight in the face. You'd better measure up, or we'll never let another woman in. No pressure, dear. When I was on duty, that was the era when the Canadian ambassador in Iran sheltered the American diplomats and personnel. So I monitored traffic about house guests. I was on duty when the Korean airliner was shot down by the Soviets. Then I was given a slot on a course in photo interpretation, because the next job was going to be where I would analyze satellite photography and come to analyze it with reference to what the Soviets were doing in the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact. Well, that was one of the hardest times, in that the chief instructor resigned when he heard that a woman was coming on the course, which of course meant that the workload increased for everyone else. And the reason he resigned was he could not accept any goddamn woman in his classroom. So when I appeared, everybody was rather hostile because their workload had increased, and I didn't know what was going on. And then they told me, and then the first day in the classroom, no teacher or student would speak to me. And this was their way of saying, we don't think women should be in the military, and we certainly don't think they should be officers, and they shouldn't have anything to do with the intelligence world. Well, as it turned out, they started to soften in the last couple of weeks of the course. And I did, in fact, top the course. And at the graduation party, the main instructor had come back because he'd withdrawn his resignation because he had no other way of supporting his family. But anyway, he certainly didn't come in the classroom. But he took me aside at the graduation party, and he explained that no, he didn't think women should be there, and da-da-da. But he said, you've proven to me that women can indeed do it, and I'll have a woman in my classroom any day. On promotion to captain, I was sent out to Cold Lake. Now, Cold Lake is one of our 2 main fighter bases, and at the time, it was the place where the pilots were going to be trained on the new CF-18, which was a quantum leap ahead in technology from the old aircraft we had been using. And the purpose of the new aircraft was so that the NORAD Canadian fighters could actually go north into the high Arctic and intercept the Soviet Bear bombers who would come across the Arctic, and as soon as they were into Canadian airspace, they could launch their cruise missiles and hit the United States. So my job was twofold. One was to teach the pilots about the Soviet forces against whom they were flying. So all about long-range aviation and the tactics and training of the pilots in the bombers. And when we did our first intercept and they came back with pictures, that was very satisfying. During the Gulf War, I was completely in war mode. Now, no, I didn't get sand in my shoes, but it was a constant 16 hours a day well, I got my first day off, I guess it was about 3 weeks. And by then I was really wondering, how did people during the Second World War manage? And, well, any of a number of wars. But what I wanted to do was to get out into the countryside and just reassure myself that, yes, the world is still here. And that had a remarkable effect. The cows were still in the fields and the trees were still here. It was a fascinating time because I had spent my entire adult life learning how to do this intelligence analysis of conflict. And here I was doing it for real. And no one knew if Hussein had his chemical weapons. Was he going to use them? Were they still usable, like the shelf life, and they're very sensitive? Did anyone know how to actually use them? They could blow up on themselves. Or was there any delivery means? And there was no answer at the back of the book, so it was an interesting time. Now, the Privy Council is basically the Prime Minister's department, if you will. So in the Intelligence Advisory Committee, I was helping to produce analysis for the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the Governor-General. You know, what is Canada's position on various issues? It was fascinating work. I was given 7 days' notice to move from Germany, which was quite a task, to completely move everything, have a full inventory of all one's belongings, 2 cats, the car, all the German administrative hoops to jump through. Plus, I had to have a civilian wardrobe for the summertime to work on Parliament Hill because they simply wouldn't let one be there in uniform. So that was a bit of a scramble. Really fascinating work, though. NORAD is an alliance between Canada and the United States. It stands for the Aerospace Defense of North America. I was sent down there to become the deputy commander of the Combined Intelligence Center. And combined simply means the two nations, Canada and United States. And it was the first time they'd had a senior officer in the decision-making process, and it was quite a challenge to take on these responsibilities. Interesting times, because of course each country has the material that it keeps to itself, Canadian eyes only or American eyes only. So to ensure that the Canadian side of NORAD got all the information it needed was a day-to-day challenge. On 9/11, NORAD was in the process of conducting a rather large exercise that it does each fall. And it's run 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so on 9/11, the headquarters and the bunker, Cheyenne Mountain, was full of people doing this exercise. And it's a way of practicing the various procedures and the routines that the two air forces would need to implement if they were defending North America for real. So early that morning, of course, Colorado is a different time zone than New York, we were all scrambling to produce the briefing from the activities overnight. And the generals were basically waiting for us in the operations center. And there is also a staff monitoring the real world. And so they were observing that there were a couple of hijacked aircraft. And in those days, NORAD was not connected to the civilian air transport world the same way that it now is. So they were just monitoring. And then the first aircraft hit the tower in New York City. They're watching CNN, the generals. Well, then things started moving very fast, and because I wasn't actually in the center where the generals were, I was preparing a briefing. But fast and furious came the reports about just what it might be, because no one knew to begin with. And the fighters were launched very quickly. And the second aircraft hit and the towers came down. Shortly after that flurry of activity, the exercise was called to stop. Stop the exercise, put it all away. We're defending North America for real now. On 9/11, the commander of NORAD was out of town, so the Canadian was in charge. The mountain, the complex where all the decisions were made, was commanded by a Canadian. And the watch that was on duty doing the real world happened to be commanded by a Canadian. So Canadians defended North America for real. And President Bush, of course, didn't say anything. Now, there's no question it was a joint effort. But kind of nice to know. And people wonder why the aircraft were not intercepted by the fighters. Well, the peace dividend after the wall came down, the decisions were made all around the world to take a step back, to lower the readiness levels. So the Americans had quite logically shut down having aircraft on standby. And so the nearest to where the airliners were was launched, but it was simply too far away to get to the aircraft in time. So the Americans were instantly at war, and this was quite an interesting time to be working there. Many people ask what it was like to be a woman in this man's world. Well, I looked at it as I was a commissioned officer, just like everyone else. I had lots to learn. I had skills and experience that I could draw on. And I just went into every new job taking that experience and knowledge with me and open to learning new things. And often my male colleagues could make that rather difficult. Oh, you can't do that, you're a woman, and women can't do that. For instance, when I indicated that as the intelligence officer I really should go for a flight in the fighters in order to understand what it was I was tasking the pilots to do, I was immediately told that women can't fly in high-performance aircraft. Your female parts will be damaged. I said, excuse me, mine are internal. Anyway, they finally did let me do the high-altitude indoctrination, which checks on how your body would react to differences in altitude. It's perfectly fine. And then I went to do the ejection seat training. And they said, oh, women can't do that. Well, of course one could. You just practiced and learned how to unplug your radio and oxygen mask and unstrap yourself so that you could get out, not pulling the ejection seat handles on the way. Anyway, I found that if you just gone on with the job and did the very best you could, that you would prove by your performance and by how well you were doing the job, whether or not you could do it. And that usually worked. I know that I have saved lives in the peacekeeping support that I've provided over the years in several very specific situations. I like to think that the part I played during the Cold War in the cat and mouse, we know that you know that we know that you know, avoided surprises and at least helped to keep fingers off the ultimate buttons. And I do know that I have helped senior decision makers at the tactical, operational, and strategic level to make very important decisions for Canada. And I know that my final posting, I helped senior officers to better understand Canada's place in the world through our strategic studies curriculum. And that's very satisfying. I also know that because I was able to succeed, that other women were going to be accepted and have been accepted. That wasn't only me, like the pioneers in the Second World War. Women wouldn't be where they are today had they not fought in the Second World War. They served so that men could fight. They took places and did things that society and men never thought women could do. I like to think we stand on the shoulders of giants. While I'm not from a military family per se, my father did serve in the Second World War in the Navy. My grandfather was with the Royal Flying Corps during the First War. And my uncle was also in the Air Force during the war. They served because their country called. They did not make a career of it. I'm obviously very thankful that they all came home. But I know that thousands and thousands did not. So Remembrance Day reminds us all of the sacrifices that so many young men and in these days young women made. I mean, to put your life on hold for 6 years and to go so far away from home and endure such hardships and death and loss and destruction. But we have the freedoms we have today because of that sacrifice. And it does continue even today, the young men and women in Afghanistan and other peacekeeping and peacemaking all around the world. We must never forget.